Hey there, guys. This is Cole. Welcome back to another movie review for the month of October. We are continuing on the Halloween horror movie reviews of Season 1, Episode 14. And for today's movie I'll be reviewing for October, it is the 1988 movie, The Blob. So, yeah, so what is the plot to The Blob from 1988? Well, the plot of the movie is as follows. In a tiny California town, high school student Brian, played by Kevin Dillon, Meg, played by Shawnee Smith, and Paul, played by Donovan Leitch, discover a strange, gelatinous substance that melts the flesh of any living creatures in its path. The deadly substance gets into the town's sewer system, where it begins growing uncontrollably, occasionally emerging to feast on unsuspecting townspeople. A military crew is sent up to eliminate the menace, but it may end up doing more harm than good. So that's the basic plot synopsis to the movie. And now, I first saw this movie back in 2019, and I liked it, and then I bought it on Blu-ray for Christmas a few years ago, and watching it again for the first time in quite a while, I still really like this movie. And what had me interested to check this movie out when I first checked it out was because it was directed by Chuck Russell, who, if you guys are not familiar with him as a director, he directed the 1994 Jim Carrey movie, The Mask, which I absolutely love that movie. It's a movie I grew up watching. But he also directed Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, my favorite Nightmare on Elm Street movie. So, as soon as I heard that, I'm like, well, I gotta check this movie out. And, yeah, I really liked this movie. And one thing I will say about this movie is that you got a really good cast. You got Kevin Dillon as the main character, Brian. You got Shawnee Smith as Meg. And Paul, played by Dr. Leitch Jr., So, a really good cast of actors playing all of it. And again, this movie's got a stacked cast. You got Meg, played by Shawnee Smith. You got Paul, played by Denovich Leach. You got Scott Jetski, played by Rick Paul Golden. You got Kevin Dillon, Brian, played by Kevin Dillon. You got Can Man, played by Billy Peck. You got Sheriff Herb, played by Jeffrey Dummon. You got Frank Hewitt, played by Candy Clark. You got, just a really stacked cast. And now, anyways, how was this movie received, and how was it made? Well, the reason this movie was made was because in 1987, when Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors came out, Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors was a huge success at the box office and was a very well-received film by critics and audiences. And so, because of that, Chuck Russell was hired to direct this movie for TriStar Pictures just a year later. When the movie released on August 5th, 1988, it received mixed reviews from critics and audiences, but it was a bomb at the box office, making $8 million worldwide on a $10 million budget, but over the years has gained a massive cult following through DVD, VHS, etc. Now, as for my reaction to the movie, I really like this movie. So without further ado, let's get into my review. So the movie starts off where it takes place on a football field where we are introduced to a character by the name of Paul, who basically plays on a football team. And he wants to date this girl by the name of Meg, who is played by Shawnee Smith, who I do like as an actress. You know, after this movie, Shawnee Smith, she would go on to star in the 2004 horror movie Saw, which, when it comes to the Saw franchise, I like the first two Saw movies. The third one's okay, but I wasn't really that big on the rest. In my opinion, Saw, it should have just been two movies as far as I'm concerned, but so it's nice to see her in here. But anyways, like I said, there's this kid by the name of Paul who wants to date Meg, but you know, she's not fully on board with dating him yet. But, you know, that's early on in the movie. Not long after that, we cut to nighttime where the character Paul is coming over so he can take out Meg on a date. But before this happens, Meg has these two brothers, these younger kids, who basically want to go see a horror movie in the movie theater, and so the mom basically asked them like what their plans are, and the brother says, "Oh, we're gonna go bowling, eat food, and go see a movie." And she's like, "What movie?" And then he says, "Garden Tool Massacre." And then he basically tells her it's her basic slice and dice. He said it's like a Friday the 13th type of movie, but the mom said, "No, I will not allow you to watch that movie." And he's like, "But mom," he's like, "I'm not going to allow you to watch that trash. Is that understood?" And she said, "Yeah." And the kid says yes. And the two brothers then go upstairs. But then, like I said, the character Paul does manage to show up at the house and stuff. He does manage to show up at Meg's house. And, you know, they go out and stuff like that. And this movie was very clever with the way it was structured, because we think that Paul is going to be the main character, but I'll get to that in a minute. But, you know, early on in the movie, we're introduced to an older man who, like I said, we're introduced to a high school student by the name of Brian, who is played by Kevin Dillon, who comes across as old man. But, you know, early on in the movie, the old man that he comes across, you know, at nighttime, basically a meteorite crashes to Earth, and it has like this jelly blob substance to it that it'll consume you and stuff like this, and well, it'll basically melt your skin away like acid. But the blob does manage to get on the old man's arm, and he's like, you know, screaming in pain and stuff like that. And then Brian, played by Kevin Dillon, and Meg, played by Shawnee Smith, and Paul, they all go out, and they basically find the old man who's injured and stuff like that, because the character Brian, played by Kevin Dillon, he sees that this blob substance stain is on the old man's hand and that he cut his hand. But Brian starts running out in the street away from the old man, and the old man runs into the car that Meg, aka Shawnee Smith's character, is driving, and Paul's in the car with them. So they end up taking the guy to the hospital and stuff like that, and they basically tell the nurse that this guy needs medical treatment and stuff like that. So then, you know, they go to the hospital, and then Paul manages to, you know, he sees the old man in a room, but he sees the old man's head turned to the side, like with his face all puffed up, you know, meaning the blob's attacking him, and he basically runs to get a doctor, but the doctor basically lifts up the blanket sheet, and we basically see that because of the acid that the blob did, half the guy's body was eaten and half the guy's body is gone now. And so he decides to call a nurse to basically investigate and stuff like that. And so Paul, played by Denifin Leach, he basically calls the cops, telling them that a guy, you know, was not so lucky at the hospital and they need to get him. But then the blob attacks then the blob attacks Paul, and Paul is screaming, and then Meg, played by Shawnee Smith, runs to his rescue, and then sees that this blob is eating him, and that it's covering his mouth, and he's covered in this pink goo, and she's screaming Paul at the top of her lungs with a horrified scream. She tries to grab Paul's hand, but because the blob is so strong, the acid of the liquid melts his arm off, and she pulls it, and, you know, as a result, it pulls the arm off. And one thing I will say that is really good about the movie, the practical effects still hold up in this movie almost, the effects hold up 37 years later. And Brian, the character played by Kevin Dillon, the cops suspect that he might have been involved with this, so he's basically held in the sheriff's station, and this does lead to a funny bit of humor where he basically tells the cops that he didn't do anything and stuff like that, and he says, you know, he says, "Am I getting arrested?" and stuff like that. And he says, "If not, I would like to leave." But then one of the cops gets all in his face, and he says, "I'm all in your face. What are you gonna do about it?" And then just to make him mad, Brian, played by Kevin Dillon, licks the cop, just to mess with him, and that really upsets him. Which I thought that scene was pretty funny. And one thing I think works really well about this movie is I think that the screenplay works really well to this movie. This movie was actually written by Frank Darabont, who, if you're not familiar with that name, Frank Darabont would go on to have great success directing movies after this. He directed The Shawshank Redemption, he directed The Green Mile with Tom Hanks, he also directed the Stephen King movie adaptation The Mist, and he did direct the first season of The Walking Dead. So he would go on to have great success after this. But then there's a part where Brian, played by Kevin Dillon, is in a diner with Meg, played by Shawnee Smith, and Meg is basically trying to tell Brian that blob, that jelly stuff that was on the old man's hand, that was the blob that, you know, attacked him, and it also attacked Paul and stuff like that. And they're in the diner waiting for their food, and then the waitress basically is horrified to see that the blob pulled one of her workers into the sink and is eating him alive. And yeah, a pretty gruesome scene, I will say, with some really good practical effects. And then the waitress is screaming, so then Brian and Meg run in to basically see what's going on, and they see that this is going on. And Meg is now remember how I said Meg was horrified at the fact that she saw the blob eat Paul? Well, she's basically crying to her parents, and, you know, the cops tell her to go home and stuff like that, as, you know, they say that she's hysterical and stuff like that. You know, she's not in a good state to talk. But anyways, going on forward with the movie, those boys I mentioned, the kids I mentioned, Meg's two younger brothers sneak into that R-rated movie, but basically the theater manager, who was someone who was friends with Meg, let them sneak into the theater and stuff like that. They're trying to watch the movie, but these two guys are annoying the kids and stuff like that when they're trying to watch the movie. But then the guy goes in the theater. He says, "Keep it down. Your mom." He says, "Your mom will kill me if she finds out that I let you see this movie," and stuff like that. And then, you know, and another thing I do really like about this movie is the soundtrack. I think that the soundtrack is rather good to the movie. But going forward with it, my favorite scene in this movie, but, you know, and so not long after that, we basically learned that a military cleanup crew is sent to eliminate the menace. That way it doesn't spread anymore, because, like I said, the more the blob eats, the bigger it gets and stuff like that. Well, basically, the dad, which basically Meg's dad, which is the dad of the two sons, and the mom, they're basically up to get their sons, but it's basically locked down in a quarantine zone and stuff like that. And one of the military guys basically says, "Look, calm down. We have the situation under control. We will get your kids." But when he's not looking, Meg, played by Shawnee Smith, goes to rescue the kids. But, you know, and this leads to my favorite scene of the movie, where the kids are at the movie theater, and one of the Meg's of the two brothers, you know, the older of the younger two, basically turns around saying to knock it off. But then the kid is horrified to see that the blob is on top of the ceiling in the movie theater, and with its tentacle, it pulled the man up and is eating him. And, you know, and everyone sees that the movie projector screen is not normal, so everyone freaks out. They run out the theater. Then Meg basically runs into the theater to rescue her two younger brothers, and she sees a woman laying on the ground, but when she picks up the woman's face, like, we see it melted away with some really good practical effects. But then Meg, played by Shawnee Smith, is able to reunite with her two brothers, and she brings them down to the sewer to get away from the blob and stuff like that. But the blob gets down there, and the blob manages to eat one of her younger brothers, but the other one is fine and stuff like that. And she's able to help her other brother basically climb out of the sewer and find a pathway to get out. But however, Meg cannot quite fit through, but a few military guys in the hazmat suits, the military cleanup crew, basically try to stop the blob from, you know, destroying and wreaking more havoc on the place. But one of them tells them, don't shoot at it, but it's too late, and then one of the blobs starts attacking the military men and stuff like that. And then we get to the epic finale of the movie where Meg, played by Shawnee Smith, is trying to destroy the blob, and and Brian, played by Kevin Dillon, is trapped in a truck. And like I said, this blob does not play around. I mean, heck, you know, one part I forgot to mention, remember the diner scene I mentioned? Well, not long after the diner scene, the waitress at the bar tries to call the police that something's wrong, but you know, but then the blob destroys the phone booth she's in and consumes her with it. Very well done scene. But anyways, let's get back to the scene I was talking about. Well, there's the whole scene where Brian is basically trapped inside a large truck. It's about to crush Brian, but Meg, played by Shawnee Smith, is able to rescue him by shooting at it. And then eventually she shoots this giant this giant tank that with all this I guess this ice basically, and it explodes, you know, destroying the creature because the creature hates the cold, and it's basically is snowing in the air and stuff like that. And then the movie ends where Brian and Meg happily reunite and stuff like that. And then the movie ends where we cut to a scene where there's this guy interviewing this people as like kind of like a presentation, and he basically holds up like this he holds up this jar with the a small bit of the substance inside of it. So yeah, really good movie on the whole front. But okay, do I have any downsides of the movie? Okay, the practical effects are really good, but there is some digital effects that don't age the best. And I'm not a fan of the ending because it feels like the movie teases it, because the movie is kind of like a sequel tease at the end, and they never made a sequel to the movie. But other than that, The Blob from 1988 is a really good film. I would recommend watching the October season. But anyways, guys, that's it for my review of The Blob 1988. And if you're wondering how I'm going to rate this movie, here's how I'm going to rate this movie on a scale of 1 to 10. So overall, if you're a fan of creature feature movies and horror movies and sci-fi, then definitely pick this up for your collection, because it is worth a watch for October. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I am going to give The Blob from 1988 a 9 out of 10. There we go, guys. That does it for my review of The Blob. And next up, I will be reviewing Creepshow, which is one of my favorite horror anthology movies, and also I am seeing it in the theaters with my dad this Sunday because it was put back in theaters for its 43rd anniversary for October. So that'll be cool to experience the original Creepshow movie directed by George Romero in theaters. But yeah, we'll catch you guys until then. Later.